The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe Manor were still burning when Elena Whitmore found the letter that changed everything. It was tucked beneath a stack of ledgers on her husband's desk, folded twice, sealed with wax that had already been broken and pressed shut again. She should not have opened it. She told herself that later, many times, on the long nights when she could not sleep. But that evening, something in her chest had already known, long before her hands did, that the paper held the answer to a question she had been afraid to ask for months. The letter was from a woman named Priscilla Dunmore. It spoke of love, of promises, of a future together once certain arrangements were made. It spoke of Elena's own inheritance, the land her late father had left her, and how it could be quietly transferred into the estate accounts before anyone noticed. It spoke of patience, and of waiting for the right moment. Elena read it twice. Then she folded it exactly as she had found it, and placed it back beneath the ledgers, her hands steady in a way that frightened her more than shaking would have. Dinner that evening was a grand affair. Duke Alexander Whitmore had invited half the county to celebrate the anniversary of his father's passing. A strange occasion to celebrate, Elena had always thought, but her husband liked reasons to fill his table with important people who admired him. She sat at the far end, watching him laugh with Lord Pembroke, watching him refill his glass, watching him glance now and then toward the door, as though expecting someone who never arrived. When the last course was cleared, and the guests had begun to drift toward the drawing room, Elena rose from her chair. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried across the hall the way a single dropped glass carries through a silent house. I read the letter, Alexander. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in pieces, conversation dying at each table as heads turned. Alexander's smile did not fall immediately. That was the part Elena remembered most clearly in the years that followed. He looked at her the way a man looks at an insect he has decided is not worth the effort of killing. Elena, he said, low enough that only those nearby could hear. Though nearby, in a room like that, was still far too many. This is not the time. You planned to take my father's land, she said. You and Priscilla Dunmore planned it together. A woman near the fireplace gasped, though whether from shock or delight at the scandal, Elena could not tell. Alexander's jaw tightened. He crossed the room in a few long strides and took her arm, not gently, guiding her toward the hallway, as though she were a disobedient child being removed from a nursery. You will not speak of this again, he said once they were alone, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. Not tonight, not ever. You will go upstairs, and you will compose yourself, and tomorrow this will be forgotten. Forgotten, Elena repeated. She looked at him, really looked, and saw for the first time how little of the man she had married remained in him, or perhaps he had always been this way, and she had simply refused to see it. You would have taken everything from me and called it love. I built this house, Alexander said. I built this name. Your father's land was always going to belong to this family. I merely arranged the details before your sentimentality could complicate them. There was no apology in him. Not even the shadow of one, Elena realized, standing in that cold hallway with the sound of laughter still drifting faintly from the drawing room, that she had been waiting for months for a version of her husband that did not exist, and never would. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window of her chamber and watched the moon move across the sky, and somewhere in those quiet hours, a decision formed inside her that felt less like a choice and more like a door closing behind a door that had already been closed. By the time the household stirred the next morning, Elena was gone. She left no note. She took only what she could carry without drawing attention. A small bag, a modest sum of money she had saved quietly over the years without her husband's knowledge, and a single piece of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, a silver locket engraved with the Whitmore crest, given to her on her wedding day as though it might make her feel as though she truly belonged to the family. She left everything else, the gowns, the jewels Alexander had given her, the position, the title. She left all of it folded neatly in her wardrobe, as though she were only stepping out for a short walk and might return by evening. She did not return by evening. She did not return at all. The carriage that carried her away from Ashcombe Manor belonged to a merchant family passing through the county, people who did not know her name or her title, who accepted her coin and asked no questions about a quiet young woman traveling alone, with a single bag, and eyes that looked as though they had not slept in days. Elena watched the manor shrink behind her through the small window, its gray stone walls catching the early light, and she felt something inside her chest that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but some strange combination of both, settling into place, like a stone dropped into still water. She did not know yet where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. Somewhere along that road, in the quiet jostling of the carriage, Elena pressed a hand to her stomach and felt, for the first time, the faint and unmistakable certainty that she was not traveling alone after all. She had suspected it for weeks, a tiredness that came too easily, a queasiness in the mornings she had blamed on the stress of the household. Now, with the manor behind her, and the road stretching ahead into a future she could not see, the truth settled over her with a weight that made her breath catch. She was carrying Alexander's child. For a long moment, panic rose in her, sharp and cold. What would become of a child born to a woman who had fled her husband, her home, her name? What protection could she offer a son or daughter with nothing but a bag of coins and a broken heart? But beneath the panic, something else stirred, something steadier. She thought of the letter beneath the ledgers, of Alexander's cold eyes in the hallway, of the years she had spent trying to earn affection from a man who measured love in property lines. She thought of what kind of father he would be to a child, if he were any kind of father at all. Whatever waited ahead of her, she decided, it would not include him. The merchant family let her off at a port town 3 days later, a place of noise and salt air and ships bound for distant harbors. Elena stood on the docks with her bag in hand, watching the water, and made the second decision of her new life. She would not simply hide somewhere in the countryside, where a determined man with money and connections might eventually find her. She would leave England entirely. She would become someone else, somewhere else, and she would raise her child far from the reach of the Whitmore name. She sold her mother's silver locket to a jeweler near the harbor for enough coin to purchase passage, though something in her could not part with the small oval pendant itself, only the chain and the setting stones around it, keeping the engraved centerpiece wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her bag. It felt important, somehow, to keep that one piece, though she could not have said why. 3 days later, she boarded a ship bound across the sea, giving her name to the ship's registry, not as Elena Whitmore, but as Nora Hale. A name she invented on the spot, drawn from nowhere in particular except a need to no longer be who she had been. She stood at the rail, as the coastline of England slipped below the horizon, and she did not cry, though she thought she might have expected to. Instead, she felt something settle inside her, quiet and resolved, the feeling of a woman closing one book and opening another with trembling but determined hands. Behind her, in the gray stone halls of Ashcombe Manor, Alexander Whitmore woke to find his wife's chambers empty, her wardrobe untouched, and no explanation anywhere to be found. He would spend the better part of the following decade wondering where she had gone, and it would be many years still before he understood what, exactly, he had lost that morning, and how much more than a wife had walked out of his life and disappeared into the wide and indifferent world. Alexander Whitmore stood in the middle of his wife's empty bedroom, staring at a wardrobe full of silk gowns that would never be worn again, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, a fear that had nothing to do with money or reputation. "Search the grounds," he told his steward, a man named Edward Halloway, who had served the family for 20 years, and had never once seen the Duke's composure crack the way it did that morning. "Search the road to the village. Send riders to the coaching inns." The search began within the hour, but it found nothing. Elena Whitmore had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed her, leaving behind only her clothes, her jewels, and a household staff whispering questions they knew better than to ask aloud. By the second day, whispers had already begun spreading through the county. By the end of the week, they had reached London. The Duchess of Ashcombe had disappeared, and no one, it seemed, knew why, though plenty of people had guesses. Some said she had run off with a lover. Others said she had lost her mind, with grief, over a stillborn hope of children. A few, closer to the truth than they realized, said there had been trouble in the marriage, whispered arguments, overheard by servants, who traded gossip like currency. Alexander hired investigators, men who specialized in finding people who did not wish to be found. He paid them handsomely and demanded results, but weeks turned into months, and the trail, if it had ever existed, had long since gone cold. Elena had left no letters, no clues, nothing that pointed toward a destination. It was as though she had stepped off the edge of the known world. What Alexander did not know, what none of his investigators ever discovered, was that his wife had already crossed an ocean, and that the woman calling herself Nora Hale bore no resemblance on paper to the Duchess Elena Whitmore. There was no trail to follow because the woman they searched for no longer existed. Priscilla Dunmore arrived at Ashcombe Manor 3 weeks after Elena's disappearance, dressed in mourning colors, as though she meant to comfort a grieving widower, though Elena was not confirmed dead, only missing. Alexander received her in his study, and for a while, her presence soothed something in him, the flattery of her attention a balm against the humiliation of a wife who had run rather than stayed to fight. "You must not blame yourself," Priscilla told him, seated close beside him on the settee, her hand resting on his sleeve. "She was never suited to this life, Alexander. Not truly. A woman of her temperament was bound to break under the pressure of it eventually. It was easier, in those early weeks, to believe that Elena had left because she was weak, because she could not bear the weight of a title, and a household, and a husband of consequence, rather than to consider that she had left because of something he himself had done. Pride, he would learn much later, was a poor substitute for honesty, and it cost him more than he could have imagined at the time. But even as Priscilla settled more comfortably into his life, taking tea in the drawing room, offering opinions on household matters as though she already belonged there, Alexander found himself troubled by something he could not quite name. It was not guilt, not exactly. It was closer to the unsettling realization that his wife's absence had left a silence in the house, that Priscilla's presence, however pleasant, could not fill. He began to notice small things. The garden Elena had planted along the east wall, now overgrown because no one remembered to tend it the way she had. The particular chair by the library window where she used to read in the afternoons, empty now, gathering a fine layer of dust. The way the servants still glanced toward the door when they heard footsteps in the hall, as though some part of the household had not yet accepted that the Duchess would not be walking through it again. Society, however, was less patient than Alexander's own, slowly forming doubts. Word had spread that the Duke had installed Priscilla Dunmore in his home with unseemly haste, and the whispers that had once centered on Elena's disappearance began to shift, quietly but unmistakably, toward Alexander's conduct. Invitations grew scarcer. Old friends found reasons to decline his company. A man who had once commanded every room he entered found himself, for the first time, met with polite but unmistakable coolness. It was Lord Pembroke, one of the few who still spoke to him plainly, who finally said what others only implied. "People are not fools, Alexander," Pembroke told him over brandy one evening, months after Elena's disappearance. "A wife vanishes without a trace, and within a month, her husband has installed his mistress in the family home. You may not have driven her away with your own hands, but you have certainly made it easy for everyone to believe you did." Alexander laughed off the comment at the time, but the words lodged in him like a splinter, working their way deeper the longer he tried to ignore them. He began, slowly, to distance himself from Priscilla, not out of any sudden moral awakening, but because her presence had become a liability to the reputation he valued above almost everything else. She left Ashcombe Manor within the year, bitter and unrepentant, and Alexander found himself alone in a house that felt larger and colder than it ever had before. Meanwhile, across the sea, Elena, now fully settled into her life as Nora Hale, had found a small coastal town where no one asked questions about a quiet young widow with a modest income and a gentle manner. She told the townspeople that her husband had died at sea, a story simple enough to explain her circumstances without inviting further inquiry, and simple enough that she never had to elaborate on details she did not wish to invent. She rented 2 small rooms above a bakery owned by a kind older woman named Margaret Coombs, who took an immediate liking to the young widow and often left extra bread outside her door without being asked. Elena found work as a seamstress, her fine education having given her skilled hands and a good eye, and though the work was humble compared to the life she had once led, she found in it a satisfaction she had never known as a duchess. Every stitch she sewed was hers alone, earned through her own effort, owed to no one. Her son was born on a mild spring morning, in the small upstairs room, with Margaret Coombs by her side, acting as both midwife and comfort, since no physician in town knew her well enough yet to be trusted with such an intimate matter. Elena named him Julian, a name she had always loved, one with no connection to the Whitmore family or the life she had left behind. When she held him for the first time, small and red-faced and crying, with the particular fury of the newly born. She felt a love so immediate and so complete that it frightened her with its intensity. "He has your eyes," Margaret told her, wiping the small boy clean and wrapping him in a soft cloth. "Whoever his father was, God rest him, this one is entirely yours." Elena said nothing to correct her. It was easier, and safer, to let the town believe what it wished. She looked down at her son's face, memorizing every small feature, and made a silent promise that he would never carry the weight of the Whitmore name, never know the coldness of a father who measured love in land and title, never be raised in a house where letters hidden beneath ledgers could destroy a family in a single evening. She would raise him herself, with her own hands and her own strength, and whatever difficulties lay ahead, she would face them without ever looking back toward the life she had left behind. The years that followed were not easy ones. There were winters when the seamstress work grew thin, and the coin grew thinner still, when Elena went without so that Julian would not have to. There were illnesses that frightened her half to death, fevers that kept her awake through long nights pressing cool cloths to her son's small forehead, praying to whatever God might be listening that she would not lose the one thing in this world that still felt entirely hers. There were moments of loneliness so sharp they nearly broke her, evenings when she sat by the window after Julian had fallen asleep and allowed herself, just for a few minutes, to remember what it had felt like to be Elena Whitmore, before she learned what her husband truly was. But there were good years too, and good days within even the hardest years. Julian grew into a curious, bright-eyed child who asked endless questions about the ships in the harbor and the birds that nested along the cliffs, who made Margaret Coombs laugh with his solemn observations about the world, who wrapped his small arms around his mother's neck each night and told her, with the complete certainty of a child, that she was the best mother in the entire world. Elena kept the silver locket wrapped in cloth at the bottom of an old trunk, rarely taking it out, rarely even thinking of the crest engraved upon its surface. It represented a life she had chosen to leave behind entirely, a name she had no intention of ever speaking aloud to her son. She told herself, in those years, that the past could be buried as completely as she had buried her old name, and for a long while, it seemed as though she might be right. She did not know then how much the past could wait, patiently, for the right moment to surface again. The fever came without warning, the way the worst things always seemed to, striking Julian on a night when he had gone to bed perfectly well and woke near midnight burning with heat and shaking with chills. Elena, then a boy of 6, pressed cool cloths to his forehead through the darkest hours, her heart hammering with a fear she had not felt since the night she left Ashcombe Manor, terrified that the one good thing she had built in this new life might be taken from her by something as senseless as illness. He recovered, in the end, though it took the better part of 2 weeks, and left Elena thinner and more exhausted than she had been in years. Margaret Coombs helped where she could, bringing broth and medicine from the local apothecary, sitting with Julian in the evenings so Elena could sleep for even an hour or two. It was during those long nights of worry that Elena understood, with sudden clarity, how completely her life now revolved around her son, how little remained in her of the woman who had once worn silk gowns and answered to the title of Duchess. By the time Julian turned 10, the little coastal town had become, in every way that mattered, home. He knew every fisherman by name, could recite the schedule of the tides better than most grown men, and had developed an early talent for numbers that impressed the local schoolmaster enough to offer him lessons beyond what most children in town received. Elena watched him grow with a quiet, fierce pride, and though there were still nights when she thought of England, of the manor she had left behind, those thoughts came less often now, softened by the passage of years and the fullness of the life she had built instead. She never remarried, despite the quiet interest of a fisherman named Henry Aldridge who had, for several years, found reasons to walk past the bakery more often than his business required. Elena liked Henry well enough, appreciated his kindness and his patience, but something in her remained closed off, unwilling to risk her heart again, in the way marriage required. She told him gently, more than once, that her heart belonged fully to her son, and had little room left for anything else. And Henry, to his credit, accepted this without bitterness, remaining a steady friend to both of them for years afterward. Julian, for his part, grew curious about his father as he got older, the way most children eventually do. He asked, sometimes, what his father had been like, and Elena always answered the same way, with the same practiced gentleness. He was a man who could not be what your mother needed him to be, she would say. But that has nothing to do with you, Julian. You are entirely your own person, and you will make of yourself whatever you choose. It was not quite a lie, though it was not quite the truth either, and Julian, sensing the careful edges of his mother's answers, learned early not to press the subject too hard. He loved his mother fiercely, and if there was pain beneath her careful words, he had no wish to cause her more of it, by digging where she clearly did not want him to dig. The years continued to pass, each one gentler than the one before, the sharp edges of Elena's old wounds, slowly softening into something more like scar tissue than open injury. She opened her own small shop eventually, using savings built up over a decade of careful work, and became known throughout the town for the quality and care of her tailoring. Julian, now a young man of 15, worked alongside her in the afternoons after his lessons, learning the trade, even as his schoolmaster continued to insist that the boy had a mind suited for greater things than needlework. He should study further, the schoolmaster told Elena one afternoon, finding her alone in the shop, while Julian ran an errand along the harbor. There is a university 2 days' travel from here that takes promising young men on scholarship. I have written to them already about your son. I believe, with your permission, he could be accepted. Elena felt a swell of pride and a quieter current of fear beneath it. The same fear she always felt when Julian's future stretched further than the boundaries of the small town that had kept them both safe for so long. But she thought of her own promise to herself, made on that ship so many years ago, that Julian would be free to become whatever he wished, unburdened by the constraints that had once bound her own life so tightly. If it is what he wants, she said, then he has my permission, and my blessing. Julian did want it, desperately, once he learned of the opportunity, and within the year he had left for the university, writing home regularly, with letters full of excitement about his studies, his new friends, the wider world he was only beginning to discover. Elena kept every letter in a small box beside her bed, reading them over on quiet evenings when the shop was closed and the town had gone still around her. It was during Julian's second year away that Elena's health began, quietly at first, to decline. She noticed it as a persistent tiredness that no amount of rest seemed to cure, a tightness in her chest that came and went without clear cause. She said nothing to Julian in her letters, not wishing to worry him or pull him from his studies, telling herself it was likely nothing, the natural weariness of a woman who had worked with her hands for 2 decades without proper rest. But the tiredness grew worse over the following months, and Margaret Coombs, older now herself but no less observant, began to insist that Elena see a physician properly, rather than simply resting it off as she had always done with lesser complaints. The physician who examined her, a careful and serious man named Dr. Alistair Finch, delivered his findings with the gentle but unmistakable gravity of a man accustomed to difficult conversations. Your heart, he told her, has been weakened, Mrs. Hale, likely by years of strain and overwork. I cannot promise you how much time remains, but I can tell you that rest and care will make a difference in the quality of what time you have. Elena received the news with more calm than she expected of herself. She had faced difficult truths before, on the night she read the letter beneath the ledgers, on the morning she left Ashcombe Manor forever. This felt, strangely, like a smaller thing by comparison, a final chapter, rather than a devastating rupture, though the grief of it still settled heavily in her chest once she was alone. She wrote to Julian, asking him to come home for a visit, careful not to alarm him with the full truth in a letter, wanting instead to tell him herself, in person, in her own words and in her own time. He arrived within the fortnight, taller now, more assured in his bearing. The boy she remembered, transformed into a young man, on the edge of his own future. Elena waited nearly a week before she told him, wanting first simply to enjoy his company, to hear his stories of university life, to sit with him in the shop in the afternoons the way they used to before he left. But she knew, as her strength continued to fade, that she could not wait forever, that there were things Julian deserved to know before it became too late for her to tell him properly. She told him on a quiet evening, the two of them sitting together by the small fireplace in their rooms above the bakery, much as they had sat together every evening of his childhood. She told him about the physician's diagnosis first, watching the color drain from his face, watching him reach for her hand, as though holding it tightly enough might somehow slow whatever was happening inside her. And then, because she could feel that the time for keeping secrets had finally run its course, she told him the rest. "There is something else you must know, Julian," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say. "Something about your father, and about who I truly am." She told him everything, then, in careful, unhurried detail. She told him about Ashcombe Manor, about the title she had once held, about the letter she had found beneath the ledgers, and the betrayal that had driven her from her own home. She told him her true name, watching his face as he absorbed the strange sound of it. Elena Whitmore, Duchess of Ashcombe, a name that belonged to a woman he had never known existed. She told him about his father, Duke Alexander Whitmore, a man of wealth and standing who had never known his son had been born, who likely believed, if he thought of Elena at all anymore, that she had simply vanished from the world entirely. Julian listened without interrupting, his expression shifting through disbelief, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like anger, though it was not directed at his mother. "He never knew," Julian said quietly when she had finished. "You never told him." "I could not," Elena said. "By the time I understood I was carrying you, I had already left. And even if I had known sooner, I do not believe it would have changed anything. A man capable of what he did to me was not a man I trusted to raise a child with any tenderness." "But he is still my father," Julian said, not accusingly, but as though testing the shape of the fact for the first time. "I have a father, somewhere, who does not know I exist." Elena reached into the small trunk beside her bed and withdrew the cloth-wrapped bundle she had kept hidden for nearly 2 decades. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing the silver locket engraved with the Whitmore family crest, and pressed it into her son's hand. "This belonged to your grandmother," she said. "It was given to me on my wedding day. I could never quite bring myself to part with it entirely, though I sold everything else. I do not know why I kept it, except perhaps some part of me always believed that one day you might need it." Julian turned the locket over in his hands, studying the engraved crest with an expression Elena could not quite read. "What do you want me to do with it?" he asked. "I want you to do whatever feels right to you," Elena said. "I will not tell you to seek him out, and I will not tell you to stay away. That choice belongs entirely to you, Julian. I have carried this secret long enough. It is time you carried the truth instead, and decided for yourself what to do with it." In the weeks that followed, Elena's health continued its slow decline, though she insisted on spending every possible hour with her son, teaching him the last details of the tailoring trade, telling him stories of her own childhood before Ashcombe Manor had ever entered her life, laughing with him over small things the way they always had. Julian delayed his return to university, unwilling to leave her side, and Elena, though she gently urged him to think of his studies, was quietly grateful for every additional day they were given together. She passed peacefully one autumn evening, with Julian holding her hand, and Margaret Coombs standing quietly nearby, the fire burning low in the small room that had been their home for nearly 2 decades. Her final words to her son were simple, spoken so softly he had to lean close to hear them. "Be whoever you choose to be, Julian. Not his son, not my burden, only yourself." Julian buried his mother in the small churchyard, overlooking the harbor she had loved, beside a headstone that read simply, "Nora Hale, beloved mother," a name that was not entirely true, and yet had been true enough, for 20 years, to matter more than the one she had left behind. He stood at her grave for a long while after the small gathering of mourners had dispersed, the silver locket clutched tightly in his palm, and felt, for the first time in his young life, entirely and completely alone. It was Margaret Coombs, in the days that followed, who finally asked him the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the funeral. "What will you do now, Julian?" He looked down at the locket in his hand, at the crest of a family he had never met, a father who did not know he existed, a life across the sea that had once belonged to his mother before it had broken her heart entirely. "I think," he said slowly, "that I need to go to England." Alexander Whitmore had not smiled easily in years, and the servants of Ashcombe Manor had long since stopped expecting him to. The years since Elena's disappearance had carved themselves into his face in ways that money and title could not soften, deep lines around his eyes, a permanent tightness in his jaw, the bearing of a man who had built an empire of wealth and standing, and found, too late, that none of it filled the silence in his own home. He had married again, briefly, some years after Priscilla Dunmore's departure, A practical arrangement with a woman named Charlotte Sinclair, daughter of a wealthy shipping family. A match built entirely on convenience and social advantage rather than affection. Charlotte had left him within 3 years, unwilling to remain bound to a man who spent his evenings staring into the fire with the distant, haunted look of someone perpetually listening for footsteps that never came. She had taken a generous settlement and returned to her family's estate, and Alexander had not pursued reconciliation, too consumed by his own private ghosts to fight for a marriage that had never held real warmth to begin with. He never remarried after that. Whether from pride, from exhaustion, or from some buried recognition that he had already ruined the one marriage that might have mattered, Alexander spent the following decade largely alone, presiding over Ashcombe Manor, with the joyless efficiency of a man managing property rather than living a life. The investigators he had hired in those first desperate months after Elena's disappearance had long since given up, their reports growing thinner and less hopeful with each passing year, until finally they stopped arriving altogether. Alexander kept their old correspondence locked in a drawer of his study, unable to bring himself to discard it entirely, as though throwing away the papers might mean finally accepting that his wife was gone for good, wherever she had gone, whatever had become of her. He thought of her more than he ever admitted to anyone, more than he had expected to in those early days, when pride had convinced him her leaving was a mercy, a burden lifted from his shoulders. It was strange, he often reflected in his quieter moments, how a man could spend years believing he did not love someone, only to discover, in the long emptiness left behind by her absence, how deeply and completely he had depended on her presence, without ever recognizing it as love at all. Lord Pembroke, now grown old himself, remained one of Alexander's few consistent companions through those years, and it was Pembroke who, more than once, dared to say aloud what Alexander privately suspected, but could never quite face. "You drove her away, Alexander," Pembroke said one evening, the two of them seated in the study, with brandy going untouched between them. "Whatever quarrel started it, whatever letter she found, you know as well as I do that a woman like Elena did not leave a home and a title behind on a whim. Something in you failed her long before that night. You did not know her circumstances," Alexander said, though the words carried less conviction than they once might have. "I knew you," Pembroke replied simply, "and I know what kind of man you were in those years. Proud, cold, more concerned with land than with the woman who shared your name. I am not saying this to wound you further, old friend. I am saying it because you have spent a decade mourning a woman you never properly valued while she was here to be valued." The words settled into Alexander like a stone dropped into deep water, sinking slowly, disturbing everything on the way down. He did not argue further, because some quiet, honest part of him knew that Pembroke was right, had been right for years, and that the emptiness of Ashcombe Manor was a punishment entirely of his own making. In the years that followed, Alexander became a different sort of man, though the transformation was slow and largely invisible to outsiders. He grew more attentive to his tenants, more generous with the estate's charitable obligations, more careful in his dealings with those who depended on him. It was not redemption, exactly, and Alexander himself would never have claimed it as such. But it was, perhaps, the closest thing to atonement a man like him knew how to offer. A quiet reshaping of his character, in the absence of any real chance to make amends to the person he had wronged most. He kept Elena's old chambers exactly as she had left them, unable to bring himself to have them refurnished or repurposed, though he rarely entered the room himself. The gowns still hung in the wardrobe, faded now with age and disuse. The chair by the window still sat empty, gathering dust that the housemaids cleared away out of habit, rather than any expectation that it would ever be sat in again. It was, Alexander sometimes thought, less a bedroom than a monument, a quiet shrine to a mistake he had never found a way to correct. There were nights, particularly as he grew older, when Alexander allowed himself to wonder what had become of her, whether she had found happiness somewhere far from him, whether she had married again, built a new family, found the tenderness in someone else's arms that she had never found in his. The thought caused him a strange, complicated grief, equal parts guilt and longing, and he never spoke of it to anyone, carrying it instead as a private weight through the long, quiet years of his middle age. He did not know, and had no way of knowing, that somewhere across the sea, a son he had never met was growing into a young man with his own mother's compassion and his own father's sharp, restless intelligence. a boy who bore, though Alexander could not have imagined it, a striking resemblance to the very portrait of Alexander's own youth that still hung in the manor's long gallery. By the time word finally reached Ashcombe Manor of Elena's fate, nearly 20 years had passed since her disappearance, and the news, when it came, arrived in the strangest and most unexpected way imaginable. A traveling merchant, passing through the county on his usual circuit of trade, mentioned in idle conversation with one of the manor's stable hands that he had once done business in a small coastal town abroad, where a woman known locally as a skilled and well-regarded seamstress had passed away some months earlier. The merchant recalled the story only because of a curious detail that had circulated through the town at the time of her death, that the woman, in her final days, had revealed to her grown son that she had once been an English noblewoman, a duchess who had fled her marriage decades before. The stable hand, recognizing the strange resonance of the story, with rumors he had heard whispered among the older servants about the long-vanished duchess, mentioned it in passing to the estate's steward, who, after some hesitation, decided the matter was significant enough to bring before the Duke himself. Alexander received the news in his study, standing very still, as the steward relayed what little information the merchant had been able to provide. A coastal town, a seamstress known as a widow, a revelation, on her deathbed, of a noble English past, a son, grown now, who had reportedly left afterward with the stated intention of traveling to England. For a long moment after the steward finished speaking, Alexander said nothing at all, standing motionless by the window that overlooked the estate's long, familiar grounds, the same window Elena had once stood beside on quieter evenings, decades before. "A son," Alexander finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She had a son." "That is what the merchant reported, Your Grace," the steward said carefully, "though I could not say with certainty whether the story is accurate, or whether the young man in question has any true connection to this family." Alexander turned from the window, and something had shifted in his expression, some long-dormant intensity rekindled after years of quiet, grieving stillness. "Find out everything you can," he said. "Send someone to that town. I want to know this young man's name, his description, everything that can be learned. If there is even a possibility that Elena left behind a child of mine, I intend to know the truth of it, whatever it costs." The steward bowed and departed to set the inquiry in motion, and Alexander remained alone in his study long into the evening, staring at the portrait of his younger self that hung above the fireplace, a portrait painted the very year he had married Elena, back when he had still believed, in his arrogance, that love was simply another asset to be managed alongside land and title. For the first time in 20 years, hope stirred in him, fragile and uncertain, alongside a dread, equally powerful, the fear that whatever son Elena might have raised would have every reason in the world to despise the father he had never known. The ship rolled beneath Julian's feet on the third night of the crossing, and he stood at the rail in the darkness, gripping the cold wood tightly, wondering for perhaps the 100th time whether he had made a terrible mistake in leaving everything familiar behind for a country he had never seen, and a father who did not know he existed. He had spent the weeks before his departure settling what little needed settling. Margaret Coombs, now well into her later years but sharp as ever, had helped him close his mother's shop, finding a buyer among the younger seamstresses in town who had long admired Elena's work and was glad to take over the modest business. Margaret had cried when he told her his decision to travel to England, though she had not tried to talk him out of it. "Your mother always said you had a restless mind," she told him, pressing a small parcel of food into his hands the morning he left, as though he were still the small boy who used to run errands along the harbor. "I think some part of her always knew you would want to see where you came from eventually. Go carefully, Julian, and write to me, whatever you find there." He had promised he would, and he meant to keep that promise, though in the strange, disorienting weeks that followed his arrival in England, he found himself uncertain how to put into words the strangeness of everything he encountered. England was nothing like the small coastal town he had grown up in. The port city where his ship docked was loud and crowded, and smelled of coal smoke and salt water, full of a bustling energy that felt both exciting and overwhelming after the quiet rhythms of his childhood home. He spent his first few nights in a modest inn near the harbor, using the small savings he had brought with him carefully, aware that he could not afford to be reckless with money, in a country where he knew no one, and had no immediate way of earning more. It took him nearly a week of careful, discreet inquiries to learn the location of Ashcombe Manor, the estate belonging to Duke Alexander Whitmore, a name that felt strange and heavy on his tongue every time he spoke it aloud. He learned, through conversations with a helpful innkeeper and a chatty coach driver who seemed to know every noble family within 100 miles, that the estate lay several days' travel to the north, in a quiet, prosperous county known for its farmland and its old, respected families. He also learned, in those same conversations, fragments of the story surrounding the Duke and his long-vanished Duchess, a story that had apparently become something of a local legend over the decades, retold and reshaped so many times that Julian could hardly separate fact from embellishment. Some said the Duchess had died tragically. Some said she had run off with a secret lover. A few, closer to what Julian himself knew to be true, mentioned rumors of some scandal involving the Duke's own conduct, though the details varied depending on who was telling the story. Julian listened to all of it with careful, guarded interest, revealing nothing of his own connection to the tale, simply a curious traveler passing through, or so he allowed the innkeeper and the coach driver to believe. He arrived in the county surrounding Ashcombe Manor on a gray, overcast afternoon, the kind of English weather he had heard described in his mother's rare stories of her old life, but had never experienced himself. The estate itself, when he first glimpsed it from a distance along the winding country road, took his breath away in a way he had not expected. Gray stone walls rose against the hillside, flanked by acres of carefully tended grounds, a house so large and imposing that Julian found it difficult to imagine his own mother, the gentle, hard-working seamstress he had known his entire life, having once called such a place home. He did not approach the manor directly. Some instinct, cautious and deliberate, told him that arriving at the front gates and announcing himself as the long-lost son of the Duchess would be reckless, likely to end in disbelief, dismissal, or worse, some manipulation, by people with far more power and resources than he possessed. He wanted, first, to understand the world he had walked into, to observe the father he had never met before revealing anything of himself. He found lodging in the nearby village, a modest room above a tavern owned by a friendly, talkative woman named Grace Pemberton, who asked few questions of the quiet young traveler, beyond his need for work and his willingness to pay fairly for his room and board. Julian told her, when she asked, that his name was Julian Hale, taking his mother's chosen surname as his own, a small but meaningful tribute to the woman who had raised him, and a convenient shield against any immediate connection to the name Whitmore. Work, it turned out, was not difficult to find for a capable young man willing to take on modest labor. The Ashcombe estate itself, Julian learned within his first days in the village, was often in need of extra hands for its stables and grounds, particularly during the busier months, when visiting families and their horses required additional care. Julian, who had grown up around the fishing boats and cargo horses of his hometown's harbor, had no trouble presenting himself as a capable groom, and within a fortnight of his arrival, he had secured a position working in the Ashcombe stables. The first time he set foot on the estate grounds as an employee rather than a distant observer, Julian felt a strange, dizzying sensation, as though he were walking through a dream that belonged to someone else's memory rather than his own. He thought of his mother, young and hopeful, arriving at this same estate decades before as a new bride, unaware of the heartbreak that awaited her within these walls. He thought of the letter she had described finding, hidden beneath ledgers in a study somewhere inside that great house, the moment that had changed the entire course of both their lives before Julian had even been born. He worked carefully and quietly in those first weeks, keeping to himself, learning the rhythms of the household from a respectful distance. He learned the names of the senior staff, the routines of the estate, the general temperament of the Duke himself, described by the other stable hands, in careful, measured terms, that suggested a man who commanded respect through discipline rather than warmth. Though several of the older servants, when pressed gently in casual conversation, admitted that the Duke had grown notably softer and more thoughtful in recent years, compared to the harsher man he had reportedly once been. He wasn't always an easy master, said one of the older grooms, a weathered man named Arthur Finlay, who had worked the Ashcombe stables for nearly 30 years. Cold, in his younger days, cared more for his ledgers than for the people beneath him. But something changed in him, years back now, after his second marriage fell apart. Quieter these days. Sadder if you ask me, though he'd never admit to such a thing. Julian absorbed every detail like a man storing provisions for a long winter, building in his mind a picture of the father he had never known, a man far more complicated than the villain his mother's careful, restrained descriptions had ever quite painted him as, though certainly no saint either. He caught his first glimpse of Alexander Whitmore nearly 3 weeks into his employment, on an afternoon when the Duke rode out from the manor to inspect some matter concerning the estate's eastern fields. Julian was tending to a saddle near the stable entrance when the Duke passed close by on horseback, and for one strange, suspended moment, their eyes met. It was only a moment, brief and unremarkable to anyone else who might have witnessed it, the Duke's gaze simply passing over a stable hand among many. But Julian felt something shift inside his chest, some instinctive recognition he could not fully name. The man's face, weathered by age and years of quiet grief, bore features that Julian had seen reflected in his own mirror 1,000 times without ever understanding their source. The set of the jaw, the particular shape of the eyes, details his mother had never spoken of, because she had never had cause to compare her son's face to the father he so clearly resembled. Alexander rode on without pausing, without any sign that the encounter had registered as anything more than the ordinary passing of a servant, and Julian stood very still for a long moment after the Duke's horse had disappeared down the lane, his heart pounding with a confusion of emotions he had not fully anticipated feeling. Anger, first, sharp and immediate, at the sight of the man who had so thoroughly failed his mother, who had driven her from her own home with cruelty and betrayal, who had lived out these long years in comfort and privilege, while she had scraped together a modest, difficult existence across the sea, working her hands raw to give her son a decent life. But beneath the anger, unexpectedly, something else stirred as well. A curiosity he had not anticipated, a strange, unwelcome flicker of something that might, in different circumstances, have grown into sympathy. Seeing in the Duke's weathered, solitary bearing, not the arrogant, cold villain of his mother's story, but a man who appeared to be carrying his own long burden of regret, however deserved that burden might be. Julian returned to his work that evening troubled and distracted, turning the encounter over and over in his mind. He had come to England seeking answers, seeking some understanding of the father who had never known him, but he had not fully prepared himself for the complicated reality of a man who was neither purely villain nor innocent, simply a flawed and aging figure, carrying the weight of choices made decades before Julian had even been born. That night, lying awake in his small room above the tavern, Julian withdrew the silver locket from where he kept it carefully wrapped inside his travel bag, turning it over in his hands, as he had done countless times since his mother's death. The Whitmore crest caught the dim candlelight, its engraved lines worn smooth by decades of handling, first by his grandmother, then by his mother, and now by him, the final unknowing heir to a name he had never claimed. He thought of his mother's final words to him, spoken so gently in those last quiet hours before her passing. Be whoever you choose to be, not his son, not my burden, only yourself. He was not yet certain what choosing meant, in this strange new country, standing so close to a father who did not know he existed. But he knew, lying there in the darkness with the locket clutched in his palm, that the time for careful observation from a distance was drawing to a close, and that some decision, difficult and irreversible, waited for him not far ahead. The incident that changed everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of unremarkable day that gave no warning of the significance it would come to hold in the months that followed. Julian had been working in the Ashcombe stables for nearly 2 months by then, settled enough into the household's rhythms that the other staff had come to treat him as a familiar face rather than a newcomer. He had grown particularly friendly with a young housemaid named Lucy Ferris, a cheerful girl of about 17 who had worked at the manor since childhood, her mother having served the Whitmore family for decades before her. Lucy had a quick wit and an easy laugh, and Julian found her company a welcome distraction from the heavier thoughts that occupied him whenever his mind wandered toward the Duke. It was Lucy who found herself, that Tuesday afternoon, at the center of a confrontation that Julian happened to witness from across the courtyard. The estate's steward, a stern man named Edward Halloway, who had served the family even longer than Arthur Finlay in the stables, had accused Lucy of breaking a valuable porcelain vase while cleaning the manor's east drawing room. Lucy, in a state of near tears, insisted she had done no such thing, that the vase had already been cracked when she arrived to dust the room that morning. But Halloway, under pressure himself from an anxious housekeeper, eager to identify someone responsible for the damage, refused to hear her explanation. You will forfeit a month's wages for the replacement, Holloway told her sharply, his voice carrying across the courtyard, where several other staff members, including Julian, had paused their own work to watch the exchange unfold. And count yourself fortunate. I do not dismiss you outright for such carelessness. Lucy's protests grew more desperate, but Holloway's mind was clearly made up, and the other servants, accustomed to the steward's authority, did nothing more than exchange uneasy glances among themselves. Julian, watching the scene, felt something rise in him that he recognized, distantly, as the same quality his mother had always possessed, an inability to stand quietly by while someone was treated unjustly, regardless of the personal risk involved. He crossed the courtyard before he had fully decided to intervene. "Excuse me," Julian said, his voice steady, despite the awareness that he was, as a mere stable hand, overstepping considerably by addressing the estate's steward so directly. "I happened to be near the east drawing room myself this morning, delivering firewood before Lucy began her cleaning. I noticed the vase already had a crack along its base at that time. It seems unfair to hold her responsible for damage that existed before she ever entered the room." It was not entirely true, this specific detail about the firewood, though Julian had indeed passed near the drawing room that morning, and had, in fact, noticed the vase's condition in passing, a small observation that now proved unexpectedly useful. Holloway turned toward him with obvious annoyance, clearly unaccustomed to having his judgment questioned by junior staff. "And who exactly are you to offer testimony on this matter?" Holloway demanded. "Only someone who witnessed the truth of it, sir," Julian replied, holding the steward's gaze without flinching, a quiet, unshakable steadiness in his manner that seemed to catch Holloway somewhat off guard. "I would not wish to see an innocent person punished for something beyond her control, if I could prevent it by simply speaking up." The exchange might have ended there, with Holloway grudgingly reconsidering his judgment or dismissing Julian's intervention entirely, had it not been for the fact that Duke Alexander Whitmore himself happened to be crossing the courtyard at that exact moment, returning from an inspection of the estate's western boundary, and had paused, unnoticed by the small gathered crowd, to observe the unfolding confrontation. Alexander had, in fact, been watching for longer than anyone realized, drawn initially by the raised voices, and remaining, once he recognized the particular quality of conviction in the young stable-hand's manner, a quality that struck him, though he could not immediately have said why, as strangely, uncomfortably familiar. "What is happening here?" Alexander asked, stepping forward, his sudden presence causing an immediate hush to fall across the courtyard, as staff members straightened and lowered their eyes in the automatic deference his arrival always commanded. Holloway explained the situation quickly, presenting it in terms most favorable to his own judgment, though he could not entirely omit the stable hand's intervention on Lucy's behalf. Alexander listened without interruption, his gaze drifting, more than once, toward the young man standing quietly to the side, watching the proceedings with the same steady composure he had shown throughout. "And you," Alexander said finally, addressing Julian directly for the first time. "You claim you saw the vase already damaged before the girl entered the room." "I did, Your Grace," Julian said, meeting the Duke's eyes without hesitation, a directness that few of the estate's junior staff would have dared to display before their employer. "I would not make such a claim otherwise." It seemed a small enough matter to correct, when a person's wages and reputation were at stake for something that was not her doing. Something in Alexander's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as he studied the young man before him more closely than he had studied any stable hand in years, the particular set of the young man's jaw, the steady, unflinching quality of his gaze, details that stirred a strange, disorienting familiarity in Alexander's mind, though he could not, in that moment, have named precisely what memory they were calling forward. "What is your name?" Alexander asked. "Julian Hale, Your Grace." The name meant nothing to Alexander in that moment, no immediate connection forming between the ordinary-sounding surname and the vague, uncertain reports his steward had gathered months earlier about a young man traveling from a distant coastal town, reports that had, in the intervening weeks of fruitless further inquiry, largely faded from the forefront of Alexander's attention, crowded out by the ordinary demands of managing a large estate. But the resemblance nagging at the edges of his mind refused to dissolve so easily, and Alexander found himself, uncharacteristically, lingering in the courtyard longer than the situation strictly required, "The girl will not forfeit her wages," Alexander said finally, addressing Holloway with a tone that closed the matter decisively. "If there is any question of the vase's prior condition, the benefit of that doubt belongs to the servant, not to convenience. See that the matter is resolved fairly." Holloway bowed stiffly, clearly displeased but unwilling to argue further with his employer, and the small crowd began to disperse back to their duties. The brief drama concluded. Lucy, tearful with relief, murmured her gratitude to Julian before hurrying back toward the manor. But Alexander remained a moment longer, his attention still fixed on the young stable hand who had spoken so boldly on behalf of a servant with nothing to gain for himself. "You spoke with unusual confidence for a man in your position," Alexander said, his tone not unkind, but carrying a note of genuine curiosity that Julian had not expected from a man the other staff had once described as cold and unyielding. "I was taught that fairness matters more than convenience, Your Grace," Julian replied carefully, choosing his words with deliberate precision, whoever it might inconvenience to speak the truth. Alexander studied him a moment longer, an odd, unsettled expression crossing his weathered features, before he finally nodded once and continued on his way toward the manor, leaving Julian standing alone in the courtyard with his heart pounding harder than the brief confrontation alone could account for. That evening, back in his small room above the village tavern, Julian found himself unable to settle his thoughts, replaying the encounter again and again in his mind. There had been something in the Duke's expression during those final moments, some flicker of recognition or confusion that Julian could not fully interpret, but that left him with the distinct and unsettling impression that his careful anonymity might not survive much longer. He was not wrong to sense it. In the days that followed, Alexander found himself unable to shake the memory of the young stable-hand's face, the particular quality of his bearing, a resemblance that gnawed at him with increasing persistence, until, nearly a week after the incident in the courtyard, he finally summoned his steward for a private conversation. "Tell me what you know of the stable hand called Julian Heir," Alexander said, seated behind the desk in his study, the same desk where, decades before, a hidden letter had once set in motion the entire chain of events that had led, however indirectly, to this very moment. Holloway, still faintly resentful over the vase incident, provided what limited information he possessed. The young man had arrived in the village several months prior, had taken lodging above Grace Pemberton's tavern, had presented himself for stable work, and proven capable and reliable, keeping largely to himself beyond an evident friendship with the housemaid Lucy Ferris. Beyond these basic facts, Holloway knew little of the young man's history or origins. "Find out more," Alexander instructed. "Where he came from, his family. I want to know everything that can reasonably be learned, and I want it learned discreetly." Holloway, though visibly puzzled by his employer's sudden interest in an ordinary stable hand, agreed to the instruction without question, setting quiet inquiries in motion over the following days. It did not take long for fragments of information to surface, gathered through careful conversations with Grace Pemberton and other village residents who had interacted with the newcomer since his arrival. A young man from a coastal town across the sea, a mother who had passed away some months before his departure, a mother who had once, according to whispered rumor that had apparently reached even this quiet English village through the merchant trade routes, revealed on her deathbed a hidden noble past. When Holloway relayed these details to Alexander, watching his employer's face carefully for reaction, he witnessed something he had not seen in the Duke's expression in all his years of service, a raw, unguarded vulnerability that briefly stripped away the composed, weathered dignity Alexander had maintained through 2 decades of quiet grief. "Bring him to me," Alexander said, his voice unsteady in a way that startled even Holloway. "Tonight, if possible. I must speak with him directly." Julian received the summons that evening with a mixture of dread and strange, unexpected relief, some part of him recognizing that the careful distance he had maintained for months could not have continued indefinitely, that the moment of reckoning he had traveled across an ocean to face had finally, inevitably, arrived. He walked toward the manor that night, with the silver locket clutched tightly in his coat pocket, his heart pounding with an intensity that made the short journey from the village feel simultaneously endless and far too brief, uncertain whether he was prepared for whatever conversation awaited him within those gray stone walls his mother had fled so many years before. The study looked exactly as Julian had imagined it from his mother's careful, sparse descriptions, though she had spoken of this room so rarely and always with a tightness in her voice that Julian had never fully understood, until he stood within its walls himself. Tall shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers, a heavy oak desk positioned near the window, a fire burning low in the hearth, casting long shadows across a room that felt, to Julian, thick with decades of unspoken history. Alexander stood near the window when Julian entered, his back turned, though he turned to face his visitor the moment Holloway announced him and withdrew, closing the study door quietly behind him and leaving the two men alone together for the first time in Julian's entire life. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alexander studied the young man before him with an intensity that made Julian acutely aware of every detail of his own posture, his own expression, as though he were being measured against some private standard only the Duke himself could perceive. "You have your mother's eyes," Alexander said finally, his voice low and unsteady, in a way Julian had not expected from the composed, authoritative figure the estate staff had described to him. "I did not notice it at first, but now that I am looking properly, I cannot see anything else." Julian felt something tighten in his chest, a confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect, but had not yet heard spoken aloud. "You knew my mother," Julian said carefully, though it was not truly a question. "I was married to your mother," Alexander said. "Elena Whitmore, Duchess of Ashcombe, though I understand she chose to leave that name behind entirely, along with everything else associated with it." The directness of the admission startled Julian slightly, though he supposed a man who had spent weeks investigating a Stablehand's background had likely already assembled most of the truth before this conversation ever began. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the silver locket, setting it carefully on the desk between them. "She kept this," Julian said, "through everything. She told me, near the end, that she never quite understood why she could not bring herself to part with it, though she sold nearly everything else she carried away from this place." Alexander picked up the locket with hands that Julian noticed, with some surprise, were trembling slightly. He turned it over, studying the engraved crest, running his thumb across the worn silver surface with the careful reverence of a man handling something impossibly precious. "I gave this to her on our wedding day," Alexander said quietly. "It belonged to my mother before that. I remember thinking, when I placed it around Elena's neck, that she looked more radiant than any woman I had ever seen. I do not know, precisely, when I stopped noticing such things about her. I do not know when I became the sort of man who could drive a woman like that from her own home." He set the locket down gently and looked up at Julian with an expression that carried more open grief than Julian had expected to find in the man his mother's careful, restrained stories had painted as cold and calculating. "Tell me about her," Alexander said. "Please. Whatever you are willing to share. 20 years, and I never knew what became of her. I searched, in the beginning, for longer than most people would have believed reasonable, but the trail went cold, and eventually, I told myself she must be gone entirely, beyond any hope of finding." Julian studied the older man for a long moment, weighing the anger he had carried across an ocean, against the unexpected, unwelcome sympathy stirring within him, at the sight of Alexander's genuine, unguarded sorrow. He thought of his mother's careful words, spoken so many times throughout his childhood. He was a man who could not be what your mother needed him to be, not a monster, entirely. Simply a man whose failures had cost them both more than either of them could ever fully reclaim. "She built a life," Julian said finally, choosing his words with deliberate care. "A modest one, in a small coastal town, far from anything resembling the life she once had here. She worked as a seamstress. She raised me alone, without complaint, though I know now there were years when the work was hard and the money was thin. She never spoke unkindly of you. Not truly. Though she never spoke of you at all until the very end of her life, when she finally told me the truth of where we came from." "And was she happy?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In this life she built for herself." Away from all of this, Julian considered the question honestly before answering, thinking of his mother's quiet laughter in the evenings, her steady, patient love, the small satisfactions of a shop built entirely through her own effort and skill. "I believe she was, in her way," Julian said. "Not the life she once imagined for herself, perhaps, but one she chose freely, and one she seemed to find genuine peace within, in the end." Alexander absorbed this with visible relief, mixed with equally visible grief, the complicated tangle of emotions playing openly across features that had, according to every account Julian had gathered, rarely shown such vulnerability to anyone in decades. "She is gone then," Alexander said. "Truly gone." "She passed several months ago," Julian confirmed. "Her heart failed her, according to the physician who examined her. I was with her at the end. She spoke of you, briefly, in her final days, though not with the bitterness I might have expected, given everything she endured." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the locket still resting in his palm, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a rawness that suggested the composure he had maintained for so many years was finally, irrevocably cracking under the weight of what he was learning. "I have spent 20 years believing I understood the shape of my own failures," Alexander said. "I told myself, in my more honest moments, that I had lost a wife through my own arrogance and cruelty, and that this loss, whatever grief it caused me, was a fair enough price for the choices I made. But I did not know, until this very evening, that I had also lost a son. 20 years of a child's life I will never be able to reclaim, no matter what amends I might now attempt to offer." "I did not come here seeking your amends," Julian said, and though his voice remained steady, there was an edge beneath it now. The anger he had carried across an ocean, finally finding its way to the surface. "I came here because my mother left me a locket and a truth I could not simply ignore, and because I needed to understand, for myself, what kind of man had done what you did to her. I am not certain I have found an answer that satisfies me, even now." "You are entitled to whatever anger you carry," Alexander said, meeting Julian's gaze without flinching, a directness that Julian had not expected but found himself, despite everything, respecting. "I will not ask you to set it aside on my account, nor will I insult you by pretending I deserve forgiveness simply because I have spent 2 decades regretting what I did. I failed your mother in ways I am only beginning to fully understand, hearing your account of the life she built without me. I have no right to ask anything of you, Julian. Not forgiveness, not relationship, not the name you were born to but never claimed. Whatever you decide, in the days ahead, I will accept it as more than I deserve." Julian studied the older man for a long, silent moment, searching his weathered features for some sign of the calculating cruelty his mother's story had described, but finding instead only the tired, honest grief of a man who had spent 20 years alone with the consequences of choices he could never undo. "I need time," Julian said finally, "to understand what any of this means, for myself, and for whatever comes next." "Take whatever time you require," Alexander said. "I have waited 20 years for even the possibility of this conversation. I can certainly wait a while longer for whatever answer you eventually decide to give me." Julian left the study that evening with more questions than he had carried into it. The silver locket returned to his own pocket at Alexander's quiet insistence, the older man telling him gently that it belonged, now, with Elena's son rather than with the husband who had failed to keep it, and her, safe. He walked back toward the village beneath a clear, star-filled sky, his mind turning over everything he had witnessed in that study, the raw grief in a father's eyes that he had expected to find cold and unmoved, the complicated tangle of anger and unexpected sympathy stirring within his own chest. He thought of his mother's final words to him, delivered with such gentle certainty. "Be whoever you choose to be, not his son, not my burden, only yourself." He understood, walking beneath that unfamiliar English sky, that the choice ahead of him would not be a simple one, and that whatever he decided in the days to come would shape not only his own future, but the fragile, uncertain possibility of some reconciliation between 2 lives that had been separated, for 20 years, by a single act of betrayal neither of them could fully undo. Word of the stable hand's true identity spread through Ashcombe Manor within days, despite Alexander's careful attempts to manage the disclosure with discretion. Servants who had worked alongside Julian for months, unaware of his connection to the family, now regarded him with a mixture of curiosity or quiet astonishment whenever their paths crossed in the courtyard or the stables. Lucy Ferris, upon learning the truth, sought Julian out specifically to express her continued warmth and support, telling him plainly that whatever grand name he now carried, she would always remember him first, as the young man who had spoken up for her when no one else would. Julian did not move into the manor itself, not immediately, despite Alexander's gentle, repeated invitations to do so. He remained instead in his small room above Grace Pemberton's tavern for several more weeks, needing the distance, needing time to process the enormity of everything that had changed since his arrival in England, before he could consider fully stepping into a life so different from the one his mother had raised him within. He and Alexander met regularly during those weeks, careful, measured conversations that gradually, slowly, began to build something resembling understanding between them, though never anything Julian would have described, in those early days, as forgiveness. Alexander spoke honestly of his own failures, of the arrogance and cruelty that had characterized his younger years, of the slow, painful process by which he had come to recognize, far too late, the value of what he had thrown away so carelessly. He did not attempt to excuse his conduct, nor did he ask Julian to absolve him of it, offering instead only the honest, uncomfortable truth of a man finally forced to reckon fully with the consequences of his own choices. Julian, in turn, spoke of his mother, sharing memories that brought Alexander both comfort and fresh grief in equal measure, painting for the older man a fuller picture of the woman he had lost, the life she had built, the quiet courage with which she had raised her son, alone, in a country far from everything she had once known. Alexander listened to every detail with the hungry attention of a man trying to reconstruct, from fragments, an entire life he had missed the chance to witness. "She would have been proud of you," Alexander told Julian one evening, the two of them seated together in the manor's library, a room Julian had come to prefer for these conversations over the heavier weight of the study. "Whatever else I failed to give her, she raised a son of genuine character. I can see that clearly enough, even in the short time I have known you. She raised me to value fairness," Julian said, "to speak honestly, even when it costs something to do so. I suppose that is why I could not simply walk away, once I learned the truth, difficult as it has been to sit with everything it means." Months passed in this careful, gradual manner, the relationship between father and son evolving slowly from wary distance toward something more genuine, though never entirely free of the shadow cast by everything that had happened before Julian's birth. Alexander began introducing Julian, cautiously, to certain trusted associates and tenants of the estate, careful at first to gauge Julian's own comfort with such exposure, before making any broader announcement of his son's existence to society at large. The formal announcement, when it finally came, arrived nearly a year after Julian's initial arrival in England, at a gathering Alexander organized specifically for the purpose, attended by the same circle of county families who had once whispered so freely about the vanished Duchess and her mysterious disappearance decades before. Alexander stood before them that evening with Julian at his side, and spoke plainly of the truth he had spent 20 years failing to discover. "Many of you remember my first wife, Elena," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly. "Her disappearance from this house was a mystery that consumed this county for years, and I bear full responsibility for the circumstances that drove her away. What none of us knew, myself included until recently, was that Elena carried our child with her when she left, a son she raised with courage and devotion, in a life entirely of her own making, far from this family and everything associated with it. I present to you tonight my son, Julian Whitmore, heir to this estate, and I ask that you receive him with whatever grace you can offer, understanding fully that any failures in this story belong to me alone, and not to the woman who raised him, nor to the son who has shown more character in adjusting to this strange new chapter of his life than I ever showed in the years that preceded it." The assembled guests received the announcement with the murmured astonishment such a revelation naturally invited, though Alexander's public, unflinching acceptance of blame left little room for the kind of scandalized judgment that might once have fallen entirely on Elena's memory. Julian stood beside his father through the evening's remaining hours, greeting a steady stream of curious guests with the same steady composure that had first caught Alexander's attention in the courtyard so many months before. It was Lord Pembroke, near the evening's end, who approached Julian directly, studying him with the careful, appraising interest of a man who had known Alexander for decades and had watched, from a close distance, the slow transformation of his old friend's character over the years since Elena's disappearance. "You have brought something back to this house that has been missing for a very long time," Pembroke told Julian quietly. "I do not know your mother's full story, nor do I need to recognize the courage it must have taken to raise you as she did, alone, in a foreign land. without ever once seeking the comfort of returning to a life of privilege that might have eased her burdens considerably. Whatever choice you make now regarding your father and this inheritance, I hope you know that you carry her strength as clearly as you carry his blood. The words settled into Julian with unexpected weight, and in the quiet weeks that followed the formal announcement, he found himself, at last, ready to make the decision his mother's final words had left entirely in his own hands. He chose, in the end, not to reject the Whitmore name entirely, nor to embrace it without reservation, but to forge something of a middle path between the two lives that had shaped him. He accepted his position as Alexander's acknowledged heir, understanding the responsibility that came with the estate and the tenants who depended on its careful management, but he insisted, firmly and without compromise, on maintaining his mother's memory as an equal and honored part of his identity, rather than a hidden shame to be quietly buried beneath the grander Whitmore legacy. He commissioned a small memorial for Elena within the estate's private chapel, a modest plaque bearing both names she had carried through her life, Elena Whitmore and Nora Hale, honoring fully the woman she had been born as and the woman she had chosen to become, refusing to let either identity erase the other. Alexander, when shown the memorial, wept openly for the first time in Julian's presence, a display of raw grief that seemed, in its own way, to finally close the long chapter of denial and silent suffering that had defined so much of his adult life. Julian took over increasing responsibility for the estate's daily management in the years that followed, applying the same careful, principled fairness that had first caught his father's attention in that courtyard confrontation over a broken vase. He was, by all accounts among the tenants and staff, a markedly different sort of master than his father had once been in his younger, harder years, quick to listen, slow to judge, generous in ways that echoed his mother's own quiet compassion far more clearly than his father's early arrogance. Alexander, in his remaining years, found in his son's presence something he had not expected to ever recover, a sense of purpose and connection that softened the long isolation of his middle age into something resembling genuine contentment. He never fully forgave himself for what he had cost Elena, nor did he ask Julian to forgive him on her behalf, understanding that such forgiveness, if it came at all, would need to arrive in its own time, through the accumulated evidence of changed character, rather than through any words he might offer. Julian, for his part, came to understand, over the years that followed, that his mother's final gift to him had not simply been the truth of his origins, nor the silver locket she had carried across an ocean and back into his hands, but the example of her own quiet strength, a demonstration that a person's worth was measured not by the name they carried or the title they held, but by the character they built through their own choices, day after day, regardless of what circumstances life had handed them. He kept his mother's shop sign, the small wooden placard that had once hung above her modest tailoring business in that distant coastal town, displayed prominently in his own study at Ashcombe Manor, a quiet reminder of the woman who had raised him alone, with nothing but her own two hands, and an unshakable devotion to the son she had refused to let the world's cruelty diminish. Years later, when Julian himself became a father, he told his own children the full story of their grandmother, Elena, the Duchess who had disappeared and become, in her own quiet way, something far greater than any title could have made her, a woman who had chosen, at the hardest moment of her life, to build something entirely her own, rather than remain trapped within a life that had betrayed her trust so completely. And in the telling of that story, generation after generation, the memory of Elena Whitmore, once vanished so completely from the world she had known, lived on as clearly and as vividly as the silver locket that had, against every reasonable expectation, finally found its way home. Grace Pemberton kept a small corner table reserved at her tavern for years afterward, jokingly telling new travelers passing through the village that a future Lord of Ashcombe had once slept in the room above her kitchen and mucked out stables for honest wages before anyone in the county knew his true name. She told the story with evident pride, and Julian, whenever he visited the village in later years, never once asked her to stop telling it, understanding that his time as an ordinary stable hand had shaped him just as thoroughly as anything he later inherited. Margaret Coombs received letters from Julian regularly across the following decades, detailed accounts of estate matters, of his eventual marriage to a thoughtful young woman named Eleanor Whitfield, daughter of a modest but respected family from a neighboring county, and of the children they raised together at Ashcombe Manor. Margaret, though she never traveled to England herself, treasured every letter, keeping them bundled together with the same care Elena had once shown toward her own son's correspondence from university, a quiet echo across generations of women who loved fiercely and expressed that love through careful attention to small, faithful details. Alexander lived another 15 years after that first difficult reunion in his study, growing gentler and more contented with each passing season, his relationship with Julian deepening steadily from cautious civility into something that eventually, unmistakably, resembled genuine affection and mutual respect. He never remarried, content instead with the quiet companionship of watching his son build a life and a family within the very walls that had once witnessed his own greatest failure. On his deathbed, Alexander asked to hold the silver locket one final time, and Julian brought it to him without hesitation, placing it gently in his father's weathered hands. Alexander studied the engraved crest for a long, silent moment, tracing its familiar lines with fingers grown thin and unsteady with age. "Tell her," Alexander said quietly, though Julian understood he was no longer entirely speaking to his son, but to some private memory of the young bride he had once failed so completely. "Tell her that I finally understood, in the end, what I had thrown away. Tell her that our son became everything she hoped he would, and more besides. Tell her I am sorry, for whatever such words are worth after all these years." Julian sat with his father through those final hours, and when Alexander passed peacefully, as the morning light broke through the study windows, Julian placed the silver locket back into his own coat pocket, understanding that it had, at last, completed its long journey between the two families it had connected across an ocean, and 2 decades of separation. He buried his father beside the small memorial he had commissioned for Elena within the estate's private chapel, the two names finally resting together in the same quiet ground, a reconciliation neither of them had lived to fully witness in life, but one that Julian, standing over both graves on a mild spring morning much like the one on which he himself had been born, felt certain both his parents would have recognized, in their own complicated way, as a fitting close to a story that had begun with betrayal and ended, improbably, in something resembling peace. He raised his own children to know both stories fully, the grand history of the Whitmore name, and the quieter, harder history of a seamstress named Nora Hale, who had built an entire life from nothing, rather than remain bound to a marriage that had broken her trust. He taught them that titles and land meant far less than the character a person chose to build through their own daily actions, a lesson he had learned first from his mother's example, and confirmed later through his father's long, difficult journey toward genuine change. The silver locket remained in the Whitmore family for generations afterward, passed down through each new heir with the full story attached, a reminder, carried carefully across the years, that even the deepest betrayals could, with enough honesty, humility, and time, eventually find their way toward some measure of healing, though never without cost, and never without the quiet, essential courage of those who chose, like Elena had chosen on that difficult morning so long ago, to walk away from what had broken them and build something entirely their own instead. And so the story of the Duchess who disappeared, and the hidden heir her husband spent 20 years searching for without ever knowing his name, became, in time, not simply a tale of betrayal and scandal whispered through drawing rooms and dinner parties, but a quieter, more enduring story of resilience, passed down through generations of the Whitmore family, as proof that even the most broken beginnings could, with time and honest reckoning, grow into something worth remembering.